the US leaders do not care about Iranian people.
Gissou Nia, thank you so much for talking with me today.
Thank you for having me on. I'm so glad we're doing this.
Yes, we've been working on this for a long time. And actually, I found an email that I sent to you in 2023, actually, and also in April. So this has been a long time coming. But I want to just read one line out of that email. I think one particular angle we can talk about is how we as a diaspora feel connected to Iran and Iranians in particular, especially now that the diaspora and those in Iran are more united than ever. I just want to sit with that.
Wow, 2 years ago. Yeah.
For the second that was true. Maybe that was true for
Understand.
a second, but a lot has changed. And so I'm glad that we're talking at this point in time because there's a lot to talk about. And I also want to mention or just tell everyone that you're someone that I've looked up to for a really long time. You've been doing this work for a really long time. And sometimes they say don't meet your heroes, but meeting you made me love you even more. So you're such a lovely person.
I'm so glad that you found me to be fun in person as well.
I really did. Yes, you're super fun and the work you do is super fun. And I'm sure everything we're going to talk about is super fun.
Yeah.
But as I said, this interview series is called Growing Up Irooni. So I want to talk about that first. So tell us, first of all, if you can introduce yourself, what you do now, and then we'll go back in time and talk about where you grew up.
Yeah, absolutely. So, my name is Gissou Nia. I'm a human rights lawyer. So, I work on a lot of different countries, not just Iran, but my job is really to try to represent victims and survivors of human rights violations and atrocity crimes. So, think war crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity. And obviously, in Iran, there is a lot, that needs to be addressed and worked on. So I think probably a lot of people know me through my work that's very focused on Iran. But I run a project that works on cases around the world and a lot of where law and policy intersect. So a lot of times it's not just cases in courts, but rather looking at how to expand justice or legal options for different impacted communities and countries around the world and before international courts and before international bodies.
Right. And so I think it's interesting that your name also is Gissou and you've been working so much on Iran the past few years, and that, Gissou means hair. And that's been such a prominent part of human rights in Iran. So that's an interesting connection that I always think about with you.
Wow, I actually had completely not made that connection. The fact that women obviously were cutting their hair and obviously the politics around hair and not showing your hair and yeah, no, my name is from Persian poetry and it means hair. But like romantic hair, I think. I think you wouldn't use it in like
Yeah.
a, you know, like I'm having a bad Gisu day. I don't think it's
No, it's romantic hair, but also it's such a symbol of power in poetry. Also, there's a lot of Hafiz poetry about this, like unlocking the power of the Gisu. And so it's a very powerful name. And I think exactly goes in line with what you do.
I feel I'm also not allowed to cut my hair really at this point. Yeah, it's got to stay long.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. Then now going back, so where were you born and what was you were born in the United States. So can you go back to that?
I was born in the US, and those who know me know that I grew up in New Jersey, very glamorous New Jersey. But now I live in Los Angeles. So a lot of people don't know that actually. They think I live in Washington, D.C., but I live in LA, where there are a lot of Iranians. And I grew up around no Iranians, I think. Yeah, in Jersey, there
Mm,
wasn't a lot of there wasn't a lot of Iranian families or anything like that. We did have Iranian friends growing up. Both my parents are Iranian, and we had Iranian friends growing up, and we were around family a lot, family in
mm,
California and family abroad. So that was lovely. But I grew up in a very different environment than a lot of my Iranian friends that I have in Los Angeles, who very much grew up in an
right.
environment where there were Iranian restaurants and there were Iranian schools and, like language schools and things like that. I didn't have any of that growing up.
Wow. So when did your parents move here? Was it pre-revolution?
My father was here studying. So he was here he was one of the students that was just here studying because back then a lot of Iranian students would come to the US and study in universities. I mean, they still do, but back then it was was probably a set part of a lot of people's trajectory. My mother and her family moved out around the time of the revolution, and then didn't go back. I mean, we go back for visits, but didn't go back to live.
So then there weren't a lot of Iranians around, but what was your relationship with Iranian culture and the language? Did y'all speak Persian at home?
Yes, so I'm the first child. So I feel like there's this situation in a lot of Iranian-American families where the firstborn is the one that gets the most exposure to the Persian
Yeah,
language, and then they kind of ruin it for all the siblings that follow after because then they're speaking English to those siblings or something.
absolutely.
It seems like, I don't know if that's the case, but my brothers also, I have two brothers and they both also speak Persian. But we did grow up speaking Persian, but I would say that, you know, everything was really about like who was getting married, what kind of food we're
Mm,
eating. It was more like everyday colloquial conversation. And then when I started doing the work I do, I had to learn a more formal language around human rights, the law, and things that I didn't learn in any academic setting because never did academic schooling in the Persian language. So it's definitely been a shift in the type of Persian that
mhm.
I speak or that I use because of work. But I grew up, I mean, we went to Iran a number of times before I started this work. Obviously, for me now, it would probably not be possible. But we used to go to Iran, and I remember having the most amazing time, as most visitors do. And, you know, they always have lots to say about the hospitality and how wonderful it is. But I grew up in a home where there was a lot of pride about Iran. It was very important that we were Iranian. And there was, you know, I mean, no shade to anybody who did that, but like I never changed my name, for instance, even though it wasn't
Right.
easy for people to say, or, you know, there was confusion about it or whatever. Like we had this idea in our home that we were like very proud of being Iranian. And so I never
Yeah.
associated it with anything negative. And I'm so grateful for that upbringing because it is like
Right.
amazing culture, amazing people, all of that. But, you know, everybody has different experiences because of whatever they were facing. And us being in an environment where there weren't that many Iranians, it would have been easy to
Right.
kind of like hide that part of ourselves or something. But I didn't have that experience growing up.
Right. So in school, like you would be proudly Iranian and like tell your friends about your culture and all that kind of thing. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. I feel like we had that in Texas as well. Maybe it would be different.
It was also that maybe, and my friend circle, I only realized this later on in life, but my friend circle were all children of immigrants. So, you know, it was like Ukrainian, Dominican, Turkish, Korean. It was a whole mix, you know, but everybody, the through line was everybody was a child of an immigrant. And I guess I related to them more probably just because of, you know, shared experiences that don't have to do with language or culture necessarily, but more of like, you know, the strict immigrant parents and like sleepovers weren't really allowed. And maybe I was allowed if it was like they knew their parents and they knew that, well, they were good parents because they were kind of like more strict about upbringing. So there was definitely some pattern there that I didn't realize until I think maybe later when I was an adult. And I was like, oh, that was interesting. Like our friend, and people would joke around and say your friend circle is the UN, you know, like you guys are the United Nations with love. But it was like later on I realized why that might be.
So then when you would go back to Iran, you're saying you had these really positive experiences of being hosted and family. Were you aware of the human rights violations as a young kid going to Iran?
That's I think what's interesting is that the times that I went to Iran were during the times that I remember were during the
Hmm.
Khatami presidency. So I
Okay.
think, you know, there was a bit of a different attitude around, I mean, there were, you know, more human rights organizations that were actually trying to operate in the country then. Of course, there was also like a parallel system that was trying to dismantle all of them, and there was a lot of problems. But at the time, the government was maybe trying to act like they were more open to the West in part, and then they took like a very hard line turn after that with Ahmadinejad, of course, as we know. But the times that I went were during that time. So I think as a teenager, I wasn't fully conscious of what was going on. I just knew that I distinctly did not like being forced to wear some form of a headscarf. Of course, it was like back there. I had blonde hair at the
Right.
time. Hilarious. And I mean, it was like a very like loose dress code, but I still realized like we had to adhere to this dress code. You always have that feeling
Right.
of when you're on the plane and then you're instructed to put it on after you get into Iranian airspace or what. I mean, it's just a very bizarre experience, right? Um, so, but I didn't have the vocabulary for what was going on at the time because I was a teenager. I didn't understand. And what jolted me into this work was seeing what happened with the disputed presidential election of June 2009 and this violent crackdown on protesters because I saw like young women being killed and, on our screens. And I thought, wait, what? Like, I knew it was repressive. I knew there were certain things you could say, not say, that you had to dress a certain way, you had to act a certain way, but I didn't think it, like, I didn't know how brutal it potentially was. Because I didn't come from unlike most of my colleagues in this space who come from families where their families were executed, their families were jailed, they were in jail themselves, and so they've known about the brutality of this regime since day one. I didn't come from a family that were political dissidents, so I didn't and we weren't part of a marginalized minority, so I don't think I understood on a visceral family level what was going on. I just knew it was not free, and we were much more free in the US. That's the only thing where, so I thought. So that was my experience.
Because when your father came, do you think he was planning to stay in the US?
No, no, he wanted to go back to Iran. He wanted to
Okay.
go back to Iran, and in fact, he wanted to move us back to Iran at one point, but it was during the Iran-Iraq War, and also we're not religious, so not the best fit. Yeah, so it was
Right.
just like very. But no, he loves Iran. Yeah, he didn't want to be outside of Iran. And my mother, same for their family. They had no intention of leaving.
And so then what did you study in school and that led you to like 2009? What were you doing before that?
So a few things happened. I mean, one is that I guess when I was in high school, I kind of understood something was wrong with the world. I
Okay.
was happy. I was a happy child, but like something was wrong with the world. And I felt that because we went to Iran and I knew at the time that apparently the governments of Iran and the US didn't like one another, right? And I thought, well, why? Because it seems like the people are exactly the same in the sense that people love to eat, they get married, they fall in love, they have children. Like it seemed like there was a lot that was similar. And also when I went to Iran, everybody loved the US. Like they would always talk about how much they love the US, right? So I thought, well, something is really wrong here. If this is supposed to be an enemy, I would see like in the media the way that Iran was portrayed. Every woman is like in black chador. It's always the mural of death to America. And I thought, well, but something's off because that's obviously not what you see when you go there. And I didn't have the
Mhm.
vocabulary for it as a teenager, I'm sure, but I just realized people must not be their governments, and even less so when a government isn't representative. So, for example, in
Mm.
Iran, the government is completely illegitimate because it's not elected and nobody wants them there at this point. Or a very select few who benefit from them want them there, but people don't want them there, and we can't dislodge them, right? So I thought there must be something wrong. And also, if people's rights are being violated, which I understood people's rights, even though I didn't know to what extreme, I knew people's rights were being violated in Iran at the time and
Mhm.
that women weren't free to do whatever they wanted and so on. So I thought, well, something must be wrong, right? And how can I dig more into that? I had those thoughts, but they weren't
Okay.
fully formed. Then when I was in school, like a classic Iranian daughter, I was pre-medicine because
Mhm.
my father, I think, was like, that's a good idea. I'm like, fine. So I was studying psychobiology or something like this. And then 9/11 happened.
Ah,
Yeah.
okay.
So I went to UCLA and there, so I was growing up in New Jersey and then I'm like, I'm out of here. I'm going to LA. I had like a full ride at Rutgers or like the state school in New Jersey. My
Uh-huh.
dad is like, that sounds like a good idea. I'm like, nope, I'm going to UCLA. And I wanted to go to UCLA because there were so many Iranians, right? And that was something I felt I was missing growing up. So I was curious. We had gone there for summers because family we had extended family that lives in California. So I started out as a, pre-medicine, and then 9/11 happened when I was in my junior year, like about to start my junior year. And the reason I mentioned UCLA is because we're on a quarter system, not a semester system. I don't know if the school is still like that. That was a long time ago.
Interesting.
And the semester system means that you wouldn't start class until end of September. And so September 11th happened, and then I remember just being completely like, "What happened here?" And so that made me, change my major to political science. I was, like, dabbling in something during my sophomore year. I remember I started, like, coming out of the math and science classes, and then I think it was English, or I don't know, I changed my major a few times, but then I went fully into political science my junior year, and I still had time to, like, sign up for those classes or, whatever. I don't know how anymore. I don't think that would be possible anymore, but back then it was, like, you had to manually sign up or something, it was I don't even think it was digital.
Right, right. You had to go into a room. You had to like fight for the front and like check box. Yeah. I remember.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I don't even remember, but I changed my major fully because I remember thinking something is really
Yeah.
off. Like, why did this happen? And also in the news, there was all this news about Muslims, about like how horrible Muslims are. And I thought, well, like again, I'm not religious, right? But I was culturally Muslim, or at least that's what I was born into. So I was like, what is like going on here? Like, what is this all of a sudden we're an enemy? Like, what's happening? So I thought that was super bizarre. And I remember people asking me about it. They're like, aren't you like Muslim? Like, because I wasn't in LA where that's like much more normal, but when I was in New Jersey, I remember because I was like home for the summer and I was like in New York, and people were like, isn't that what you are or
Right.
something? People thought that was a cult before. Like, they didn't know
Right.
what like, people don't know that, but before 9/11, like, people didn't know
Right.
what a Muslim was. They thought it was a cult, or they weren't aware it was, like, a major world religion? So, that's really what put that under the microscope in the US, and so I just thought, like, something is wrong. Let me try to study more what that is, and so I
Wow.
had an emphasis on studying the Middle East in college, and anyway, I switched my major, and the rest is history, kind of.
So before that, you weren't really political? Like y'all didn't have political discussions at home, like talk about.
Well, no, now that I think about it, I mean, of course, I don't know if all Iranians are political, but that has been my impression so far, basically, down to like a cab, your Uber driver is gonna like school you on everything from A to Z. But definitely at the Mehmoonies, I remember all the men were always talking politics. I wouldn't say that I saw like, and then I would just like at some point then I was just throwing myself in there and talking about politics after like 9/11 and the things that I was, starting to learn and start to get invested in. So I had no business like throwing myself into those conversations, but I was doing that nonetheless. But I remember there was always like a group of men talking about, whatever, whatever. And like I think sometimes, the women were like, we're just gonna go make tea, and like I don't like they probably had heard the same conversation for decades, so they were over it. But no, I remember that.
But But I like this that you had kind of a, like, blank slate of kind of a naivete of like, "Well, this just seems weird." Like, you come into it. I feel like a lot of times things get complicated with all these words and all these like, this history and that and that and that, but at the simplest level, like, it's just wrong or it's
I
weird.
wasn't steeped in any of that growing up. So I remember one thing my mom would always tell me is don't ever speak about politics or religion because it just creates problems. It was some version of that. Did the opposite.
So then you went right into it.
I
Yes,
did the
okay.
absolute opposite.
Okay, so then you studied political science, and how did you get from political science to The Hague?
So I think at the time it was sort of like the heyday of international law. I know these days it's having or we're in some rough periods where international law is concerned. But in the 90s and the 2000s, there was a lot of emphasis on international law because there were these what they call ad hoc tribunals, one about the genocide in Rwanda. And so that was a court that was based in Arusha, Tanzania. And it's the ICTR. It's like it's a International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, long name. And then there was another court about the former Yugoslavia. So obviously there was a really horrible ethnic, religious, civil conflict in the former Yugoslavia, which then disintegrated into different countries that exist today. And there was a court that was set up to deal with, the claims of genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity that came out of that. And the Yugoslav tribunal was based in The Hague, which a lot of I have like a little Instagram video about this. A lot of people think that's a court, but it's not. It's a city where there are different international courts, including the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice, these ad hoc tribunals. And the Rwanda one was in Tanzania, as I said, so it was in Africa. But at the time, there was a lot of discussion of these courts. They were set up in the 90s and they were operational in the 2000s. And there were a number of other courts too, like the Special Tribunal for Lebanon, which was also based in The Hague, the Special Court for Sierra Leone, which was about, the violence in Sierra Leone and Liberia. And a lot of these courts have now like wound down their business, but there were a stream of courts and different, idealistic lawyers that were going there, young lawyers who were going there to work on these cases. And along that same time, there was a court that was formally established called the International Criminal Court, which we all know is today. And that's the first permanent international criminal court. So it kind of took the work of all these ad hoc tribunals that dealt with individual criminal responsibility for different countries. And it just said, you know what, we need one permanent court that deals with this, regardless of what region or country or situation this is dealing with. We can bring it before this court. It was very idealistic, and I absolutely don't think anything like that could be created in today's environment. It's really incredible that that was negotiated in the 90s. The Rome Statute, which animates the court, was negotiated in the 90s, and the court came into force in the early 2000s and started operations. So I was in The Hague during the 2000s and then in the 2010s, and that's when there was a lot of this work going on. And so when I was in law school, I already knew about these courts because I was going to law school at a time when these courts were being set up or the courts were really operational. And I thought, I need to get there because the idea, again, going back to when I was a teenager, and I thought, like, how could these governments not like one another? What does that mean about the people? And what does that mean about the people living under a dictatorship? Like, how do they get right? How do they secure their rights? Because they can't go to a court. Or how are they figuring that out? And it occurred to me that this idea of an international legal order, or the idea that those people could go to an international court and seek justice, I mean, that was really appealing. And I thought, well, I want to get to that court somehow. So I lobbied my way into an internship, basically because somebody dropped out. Like I I went to like a very average law school, I wasn't like at a top law school or anything. I just went to the law school that gave you the most money basically to study because being a human rights lawyer is not a lucrative field. Yeah, and I didn't want to go into private practice. I knew that, so just went wherever I got the most money, and then I was like, how do I get an internship? Because these were really competitive slots. Like a lot of people wanted to work at these courts. And I was just calling this office in The Hague for, several weeks, being like, I need to get an internship. And then the guy's like, this Dutch guy who was running the office is like, we don't have anything. He's like, if something opens up, I'll let you know. And then one day somebody dropped out. And he just said, if you can get yourself here, then the internship is yours. And, I convinced my dad to give me some, like, I was lucky because these, internships were unpaid at the time. Now internships are paid, of course, but, like, back then, no paid internships. So, obviously, if you didn't have the money, like, it kind of selects in that way. I, like, begged and begged my dad to just give me, like, enough money to get a place to stay there, and I was lucky I had him, and he supported me, and then I just packed my things and left in, like, a few days.
And I'm just curious, I mean, we can get into this very detailed, but what was it like? Like, a lot of young people like go to New York or they go to LA, but you're going to The Hague. Like, what's the city like? Like, are there other young people? Are you going out and getting drinks? Is it like, what is it like?
So the good news is that there are a lot of people who are from other parts of the world who are there. There's a big like what they call expat culture. And because English is the lingua franca, that or French, basically, I could communicate with people. So that was never a problem. It wasn't this, I'm going to a new country and literally I can't communicate with anybody or I have to figure it out. So and in the Netherlands, everybody speaks English because it's a small country. And so, that's a lot of privilege that we have as Americans, like having been native English speakers and everything. It's pretty easy to navigate going to new countries where people are speaking English. So I didn't have any problem there. But yeah, things were really different. I mean, obviously, it was very different. And I had to learn a lot of things very quickly. And I was there to basically try to prove myself and try to get a job. Um, but I went during law school. So I also had to convince my law school. It wasn't a posh law school, so they were like the HR person was like, she had never heard of The Hague. Like she didn't know what I was talking about. They've since changed up their standards, but back then it was like they didn't know. And she was like, you can't go, you have classes. I was like, no, you don't understand. Like all I want to be is an international lawyer and you're going to let me go. And I like did whatever I could. And I had to agree to take classes at a university there called Leiden, which is actually one of the leading universities for public international law. So it was fine. But I really had to convince them to let me go. They did not want to let me go. And that was in January. So it was basically going to be for that semester. So I went for the full semester.
Amazing. For the young people listening, that's a very inspirational story. Just you got to make your own path,
Yeah.
whatever you're doing. But then,
Yeah.
so when you went there, were you working on Iran from that time?
No, because Iran is not subject to any of these international courts, which feeds later into why I got interested into doing what I partly do now, about building justice options on Iran.
Yeah, so
'Cause it's
let's
not
get into
easy.
that. And
Yeah,
which you've
so
had
I
a
was working in
you've had
Yugoslavia,
a big
former Yugoslavia.
breakthrough, we should say now. Just spoiler alert, but
Yes. But, I was working on the former Yugoslavia. So I was working on cases involving Bosnia. um, the cases I was on were involving Bosnia and, Croatia and Kosovo,
oh wow, okay.
which used to be part of Serbia, is now a country that many countries recognize. They are a country, but some bad apples don't recognize them.
Right, right. Okay,
Yeah.
so then let's transition to how you became involved with Iran and what
Yeah.
you're doing now.
So basically, after I was an intern, I managed to get hired by one of the lawyers that had been, on the case that I was on as an intern. And after I graduated law school, I did a clerkship and then I went to The Hague. So then I was there.
And actually, sorry, pause. What about your father? Like he had asked you to do law school or medical school when you transitioned. Like, what was his reaction? I'm just curious.
He was fine. He's a math science guy, his PhD is in applied math or something like that. So it's like, I think that's just what he knew. But also, like, my brother became a doctor. So, like, he's good. Yeah.
Okay, it's fine.
It's fine.
Okay, just checking.
Yeah.
That was an aside.
It's fine.
Okay, go
Yeah,
on.
he got his doctor. But he was just suggesting what he knew, and that was what he knew. But no, they're amazing. They're like my biggest. Yeah,
Okay.
I love them. So I was in The Hague. I did that, and then at some point there was that disputed presidential election of 2009. I mean, election. Let's call it a selection. It's total sham, obviously. And I saw that there was a lot of violence being directed towards innocent people that were not doing anything other than peacefully protesting for their rights. And back then, the slogan was, "Where is my vote?" It wasn't even like down with Jumhuriyet Islami, like down with the Islamic Republic. It was actually like calling for change within the system.
Yeah, which a lot of people who, I mean, we're roughly the same age, so I was around then too. A lot of people who are just now becoming like cognizant of Iranian politics are just like, why wasn't there just regime change like called for back then? But like you were saying, like Khatami was there. There was this kind of hope, even though like it was still a foundation of shit. Like it was still women were 50% the worth of a man and all that kind of stuff. But there was some hope that that would change. There was like the million votes that women signed to have more rights and have more. There were a lot of things happening. So I think it's important to know that context. Like you're saying, it wasn't full on, let's do regime change. At that point, people were tired. There was like the Iraq War. There was all this stuff that they'd gone through. So at this point, it was like, okay, let's evolve into a better direction. So yeah, it was Where Is My Vote?
And also, we have to think of who would think that way. So a lot of the people that had left Iran that were exiled, either because they were with the former, they were somehow involved with the monarchy, or, they were like operating during the Shah's time, or because they were leftists, or because they were MEK, or like whatever. These are people who came out. If they weren't killed or jailed or whatever, they came out. And so a lot of the people who are in exile are people who knew how horrible the Islamic Republic was from the jump, because their families personally were victimized in one way or the other. Their family members were killed, or like, they were Tudeh and they were all killed, or whatever. Or they were Baha'i and they understood, like, very fundamentally, how rotten this all is. Um, but a lot of people inside Iran were more like trying for reform in the 90s, So it was like a little bit of a different posture. And that was the bulk of people. Like, a lot of the people who are loudest now about regime change were actual reformists before. I have nothing to do with this because I was in the US, and so I didn't really know about Iranian politics. It's never really concerned me, other than what are the human rights violations that are happening and who is perpetrating them, and let me hold them to account. So for me, the actor of who's doing that is really irrelevant. It's just like who's committing the violation. And I think fundamentally you cannot have a human rights um, positive framework in the country with the Islamic Republic. I think these two things are just like completely incongruent. So for me, that's just, there's no reform question. But again, I was not active in Iran. People who are Iranian activists, I'm going to look to them to see what they think. They know best. They live there, they operated there. People who are recently exiled also completely get a say, because they probably have spent all their formative years in Iran and they were forced out. Um, but it's difficult for like somebody like me who's been on the outside of the country. Like, I'm not going to say like I get to decide that. Like, I wasn't an activist inside the country. My function is just to help with the things that I do know how to do, which are accountability, and for those who are seeking that, to just like help with that process.
That's a great point. But yeah, so going back to 2009, so they were saying, Where's My Vote? And then there was this brutal crackdown.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people were shocked because for a period, there was nothing like that. So there were brutal, brutal executions right after the Islamic Republic tried to entrench its power. There were like mass executions. There were mass executions in 1988. And then there were chain murders of intellectuals, even during the so-called reformist era, right? So there was violence throughout, but like this violence after 2009 was like something they hadn't seen since the 80s to that degree, right? And so I think people were really surprised and shocked. I was just getting introduced to this, and I thought, well, what this needs is an investigation. Like, why are we not bringing court cases? Could this be something that this newly formed International Criminal Court could look at? Is it, even though Iran is not a member, is there a way to make it come under the jurisdiction? And so at the time, I organized a petition with another international criminal lawyer who was a prosecutor in a different case. And we organized a petition that said, we believe that the International Criminal Court chief prosecutor at the time, he was the first one. His name is Luis Moreno Ocampo. He's a well-known prosecutor from Argentina. We said that we believe he could look at the situation of Iran, and we laid out the reasons for why. We said the court has a deterrence function. We think that you can actually look at this, even if it doesn't formally come under the jurisdiction. Like, there were a number of reasons that we sent out. That wouldn't work today, but at the time when the court precedents weren't as fully formed, we thought there was an argument. And I got 200 practitioners to sign on to that letter. So it wasn't a petition that was just for the public. It was for people who were working at the courts, for them to make the legal argument to the prosecutor, and that they agreed with this theory, and for us to deliver it to the prosecutor. And then we had Shirin Ebadi, who was the Nobel laureate at the time. She had won the Nobel like just a few years before that, really. We had her deliver it to the prosecutor. It was a quiet thing. It wasn't with the media, but it was to make him open this. And he laid out a reason for why he couldn't do it. And it was like he gave reasons. It wasn't just like a no or something like this. But I remember thinking, well, this can't be. Like, this cannot be that there's no forum for us to go to bring out this justice option. And that's what started me on working on Iran.
Wow. Okay. So that was in 2009. And then what happened after that?
So I thought, well, I better join an Iran human rights organization because I didn't know anything about work on Iran. I had been working on the former Yugoslavia. I did a brief case on Kenya.
And you'd graduated at this point?
Yeah. Law school was behind me. I had been working for several years. I worked on cases at the ICTY, the Yugoslav Tribunal, for 3 years or something like that. And then I did a small matter at the International Criminal Court. So there was different courts that I was working before and working on trial level appeals. I was also working on the defense side. That's something a lot of people don't know, but I was actually defending some of these alleged war criminals. And the very useful thing about that is I got to start to understand the psychology of bad men,
Wow.
which has proved very useful
Wow.
for me in the current. Yeah, because I believe, of course, everybody, these courts are not kangaroo courts, so everybody deserves a defense, and it's important. The defense function is important to make sure that we're not just, you know, um, convicting people without due process, and very relevant in these times.
Oh,
But
yeah.
it's very important. It's very important to have that, and so I believe in that. But it was fascinating because I got to see, just what the psychology is. And I also got to see how the defense attorney would poke a zillion holes in a prosecutor's argument. And so that helps me a lot now in my current work, which is obviously a lot more prosecutorial in nature.
Interesting.
Yeah. So I was working on those cases, and then I was like, all right, I gotta leave. Because I remember Twitter was a new tool at the time. And I remember I would just be in court because we would go to court every day. We had to wear these robes, like British barrister robes, basically,
Uh-huh.
not the wigs, just the robes. You could wear whatever you wanted underneath. It's very convenient. But we had computers in the courtroom, and I remember this is very bad, but I was just scrolling through Twitter and reading all the tweets. A lot of them were in Farsi, actually. And that's how I started improving my Farsi, because back then you couldn't Google Translate.
Wow. And for some context, Twitter came out in 2009 during South by Southwest, so in March, and then the Green movement was in June, and so Twitter was a big part of it. That was kind of the first movement that was on Twitter, and then it got derailed by Michael Jackson's death, but that was later.
Yes. Yeah.
But for a while, that was all the tweets were about Iran. It was very exciting.
Yeah. And people still remember that from that time period. Like, oh yeah, the green, even non-Iranians, I remember, yeah, green movement.
Yeah.
But I had to learn, that's how I had to learn Farsi. Yeah, how I had to learn Persian.
Interesting. Okay, so you didn't know how to read and write before that?
No, like Baba Abdad, that kind of like the books that you get from Iran. I didn't know how to read. And so it was only because of that experience. So now it's become like quite easy because you can sort of Google Translate or ChatGPT, and you can just, but back then, like I couldn't do that. So I would be stuck if I really couldn't read. And so I got a tutor.
Okay.
I remember I like saved a bunch of money to get a tutor. And I was applying to jobs at Iran human rights organizations, or at human rights organizations that needed Iran researchers. And I remember I applied for a job at Human Rights Watch. And well, this is shady, but I pretended that I could read Farsi.
Right.
I'm sure they figured it out. Shout out to whoever was interviewing me. I'm sorry. But I got shortlisted.
Okay.
I got shortlisted, I think, because I had the investigator experience. Like I had run investigations into, crimes against humanity and things like that on the ground in Kosovo and whatnot. So actually that was a different witness intimidation case, but I had run investigations. And so I've been part of investigations rather. So I had that skill. And so I think that's why I got shortlisted, because they're like, okay, like she's been at the court. She knows how to put something together. But a requirement was that you need to be fluent in Persian. And I just pretended I was, which of course was like a total lie. I mean, I could speak it, but obviously I couldn't read it or write it.
Right.
So I got a tutor. I remember I like saved my money. Tutors are expensive. And I got a tutor, and I was like intensive, immersive learning. And I got to a place where I could like somewhat read.
Right. And you're like reading terms that have to do with something that you weren't familiar with before. Like you said, you only knew like kitchen and weddings and parties.
I had to learn like Hula Bashar, like, Qanun, like Ghazi. Like I didn't know what
Hukm idam. hukme idam.
I didn't know what any of these, things meant, right? So I had to learn all that. It was a quick and steep learning curve. Um, and then I just tried to wing that. Of course, I didn't get the job. But the fun news is that the person who got the job vacated a different job at an Iran human rights organization, and I got his job,
Okay, great.
who maybe didn't have the need for me to be fluent in Persian and maybe had more lax standards. I don't know, but I
Right.
got that job, and then I eventually became the executive director of that organization, Iran Human Rights Documentation Center. For anybody who they're still doing great work. They've been around since 2004. They're a great resource. And that's how I started getting really deep into the Iran work, was through that
And what
experience.
year was that?
So when I was ED, executive director of that org, it was from 2011 to 2014, I guess.
So yeah, so you've been in this for a really long time.
Yeah. So basically, since after the Green Movement, I was like, I'm going to be working on this. And I've seen a lot of things since then. And I've seen a lot of people who originally were even in with the regime, like now say that they're opposition. So I've seen a lot of people change over time.
Wow, okay. And what about
Mhm.
yourself? Like has your stance changed, or have you kind of gotten deeper into that first initial feeling, like even after September 11th, of like this is just weird?
Well, I think I always came at it from a human rights perspective, and that's never changed. So I think it means that I'm less susceptible to thinking like this leader is the right leader or that leader is the right leader or this, because for me, it's like, who is just going to uphold human rights? And as soon as I see authoritarian tendencies from anybody, I usually think that's not very compatible with human rights. So my thing is like, I think there needs to be teamwork. I think there needs to be people that build consensus. I think there needs to be more decentralized leadership in general around the world. Like that's how I think. But that's because I see what typically yields better human rights outcomes. So it's very connected to that. So I'm not very political in a sense. I mean, all human rights is political, I guess, but you're never going to see me either being like super US partisan, like red, blue, whatever. There was a whole discourse after Women Life Freedom where people in the US who are of Iranian origin started saying, like, you need to, if you support the Democrats, you're this, or you got to support the Republicans, or like, it was like very extreme. And all of it, in my view, was totally irrelevant. And we now see how true that is because, for example, President Trump was saying that he wanted to eviscerate this Iran nuclear deal. And it turns out he's negotiating the same exact deal as Obama
Right.
once did. It's even the same like enrichment requirement red line that his negotiator Steve Witkoff just put forward. So he just had a problem with a deal that said Obama on it, but like he didn't have a problem with a deal. He's a deal maker. Like that's what he wants. I knew it was all transactional. So for me,
Right.
again, it's like there's no like the US leaders do not care about Iranian people. That's
Right.
like the first thing to understand. Once you
Right.
understand that and you know that what you're advocating for with governments is for them to do certain things that you want so that you can have a better human rights outcome, then it changes your lens
Mm.
and then you don't become so susceptible to like, this is the way or that is the way. It's like all these things are not going to be the way. The way is by building like a strong movement inside Iran, which is very much up to the Iranian people. And our job on the outside is to help facilitate that in any way we can. So yeah, there might be some leaders that are better than other leaders, but um, to try to just like export that partisan, like a US partisan lens onto that just doesn't make sense because
Mhm.
that's not how the US leaders are making
Right.
their decisions.
That's such a good point. And then what is it? Can you talk about the and gender apartheid work that you've been doing and the new developments that happened at this week, I think. Is that right?
Which ones? I don't know. Maybe.
Didn't you guys make a big breakthrough? I forget. I forget what happened. There's like every day things change
Well,
so much.
yeah, well, the treaty has moved to negotiation, so I'll raise that. But part of our team is actually in South Africa this week to speak to folks that were integral to dismantling apartheid in South Africa, to speak to them about codifying the crime of gender apartheid. So, in a nutshell, gender apartheid is basically the crime of apartheid, which right now, as defined under international law, only applies to race. So that was born out of the experience of South Africa, where a white South African minority was oppressing and subjugating a non-white South African majority, and Black South Africans were dealt with the worst, and then other non-white South Africans were also restricted in different ways. But there was restrictions on freedom of movement. There was exploitation of labor. It was very like, to situate in what would be analogous to the US, it's very like Jim Crow, but worse than Jim Crow. So something like that. And the thing is, that was only dismantled in like 1994,
Wow. Wow.
basically, in like 1990, 1994. So in many of our lifetimes, like that was, and so also when you look at some of the very famous white South Africans that are now here in the US and have such an influential role in our politics, it's really fascinating because some of them didn't have any problems with the apartheid system. And so, but a lot of Americans don't have the context for like, wait, what was apartheid era South
Wow.
Africa? It was brutal. It was a completely racist system that, wouldn't like that existed in many of our lifetimes. And those people were proudly part of that. And they're now coming here. And a lot of people don't know that history, right? So something to think about as we think about those characters.
Yes.
Um, but basically the end gender apartheid effort is really seeking to codify this crime of gender apartheid. And what we're seeing,
And when did that term gender apartheid start getting used?
it's been used for decades.
Oh, okay.
So so the term gender apartheid, or apartheid jinsiati, as Iranians would say it, or as many Afghan women who are Dari speakers say it. They say Dari or Farsi, but those speakers would say apartheid jinsiati. I don't know how to pronounce the term in Pashto. We do have it on our logo, but
Ah,
I don't know how to say it exactly. But there's a leading Afghan activist who was using it, decades ago. During the first run of the Taliban, people referred to the term of gender apartheid. So that was something used to describe the system. Masih Alinejad, who's a famous, of course, like anti-mandatory hijab campaigner in the Iran context, she was using gender apartheid like forever. She was talking about that forever as a concept. The thing that people were not speaking about is codifying that crime. And what I mean by that is making it into a formal law. So when I spoke to a lot of the activists, they didn't realize that it wasn't already a crime that a prosecutor could charge.
wow.
They just assumed it was because it's such a heinous crime. And
Right.
it's basically this crime of where a regime is entrenching their power by subjugating and oppressing a group. And in the current definition of apartheid, it's one racial group that's oppressing another racial group. What we're seeking to do is just add the term gender to that.
Right.
So then it could apply to a situation in which, for example, men are oppressing women, or anybody who, doesn't fit the strict binary of man and woman.
Right.
So
Okay.
victims can also be men. Victims are not only women in a gender apartheid regime. They can be men that are allowing women to go to school. They can be men that don't fit strict gender norms. They can be non-binary people, so it can be broader than that. But the push to make this a law it began with somebody named Karima Benoun, who is a former UN Special Rapporteur, an amazing Algerian-American academic and lawyer. And she had written a lot of literature about how could we codify this crime. And when I had this idea over, like, we need to make gender apartheid a crime, we actually did a Google where, like, has anybody tried this? Because I had heard the term, but I didn't know if anybody was pushing. And we saw Karima had literature. We're like, okay, because I'm like, I'm sure somebody's thought of, like, I can't be the first. I saw, yes, I had the idea like in the shower or something. And then I looked and I was like, okay, no, Karima has written about it. And there was like one or two other people who had written something about it, right? Somebody named Penelope Andrews, who's an amazing South African academic and law professor now here in the U.S.
So all women so far have worked on it.
All women.
Okay.
Yeah, all women writing about it.
Okay.
Somebody named Ann Meyer, if I'm not mistaken, but all women. So then I was like, all right, well, we need to get more media on this because, I reached out to these people, of course, the first step, because I'm like, well, they've been doing scholarship on this. Let's figure it out. And also, I was like, we need to apply an international criminal lawyer lens. So let's figure out how else we could codify this, or like looking at it through that framework, what would we need to do? So we put together, there was like a whole group of people that put together a letter in March 2023, and created this website, and gendeраpartheid.today. And there's no one group or individual associated with this. It was like a lot of people who were behind this idea. And then it started to get a lot of media. And then a lot of prominent people started to back it, like Malala Yousafzai, Nargis Mohammadi, all the way from Ebbing prison, and when she was out, especially on furlough, she was all over the place giving interviews. And then Agnes Callamard at Amnesty International came out and formally supported it. And a bunch of UN experts, a bunch of like the head of UN Women formally supported codification. The head of the human rights commissioner, like the head guy who does human rights at the UN, he's backing it and talking about it in speeches. So it's really taken off. And now, there's so many people who are working on this, and there's an effort to include it in the Crimes Against Humanity Treaty, which is, we have global treaties on war crimes. For example, we have the Geneva Conventions. People have heard of that. We have this global treaty on war crimes. We have a global treaty on torture. It's called the Convention Against Torture. We have a global treaty on genocide, of course, the Genocide Convention, which has been discussed a lot in recent years. We don't have a global treaty yet on crimes against humanity. We do as part of, for the International Criminal Court, like not to get too into the weeds, but like we don't have one that would apply to states, or that would apply to state responsibility, not just individual criminal responsibility, which is a bit different. So there's this treaty, global treaty, that's being negotiated before the UN, and the text hasn't been finalized and adopted yet. So we were like, we should get it into this treaty. And there's an incredible lawyer who works with us named Akila Radhakrishnan, who had been working on looking at gendered crimes in the Crimes Against Humanity Treaty. And we, linked up with her, and basically we want gender apartheid to be included in this. And so she's been leading on a lot of that work. And that treaty was sent off to negotiations in November. So it's actually moving forward, and there's like a real shot that we get it in there.
Well, so is this something that like the public, like people listening to this podcast, like what can we do to support this work?
There's a lot that the public can do. So I need to actually roll this out on social media and have people see like exactly what we would want them to do. But there's going to be a need to push different countries around the world to explicitly say that they want gender apartheid in this treaty. And part of that is they're going to listen to the public. So they have a lot of priorities. The world is also going crazy right now. So there's a lot of things they're focusing on. And unless they feel pressure to focus on this, then they might not, right? So we already have 11 states that are supporting, which is incredible, because on legal things, states move slow. They need legal.
Like states in the United States?
Oh, no, like countries.
Okay, got it.
Yeah. Like UN member states.
Gotcha. Okay, yes.
States with a capital S. Yeah, this is so confusing.
I was like, Texas is in. Texas.
So in international law, when you say states with like a capital S, it basically means countries. That's how it's referred to. But yeah, it's like New Jersey, like let's throw us in. So basically countries have to support, and legal advisors at foreign ministries around the world have to say, like, do we actually agree with this or not? It's not just a political consideration. They can't just like say, yeah, this is a great political resolution, let's back it. No, it's more complicated. They have to like sit with the definition and see if they approve it. And so they need some support from the public. I mean, they need to feel that the public wants this. And in many ways, the only reason this work has moved forward is because of Afghan and Iranian women being on the front lines and saying they want this. Like that's really what's driven this shift. So like hats off to civil society, because they're the ones who are making the difference. But there's going to be actions that will roll out that people can take, like sending letters to their foreign ministers, posting about it. If people are already not following us on social media, definitely follow us on Instagram.
Yes, we'll link to all of those.
Yeah. Follow us.
Yeah. And gendeраpartheid.today, is that right?
And gendeраpartheid.today.
That's right. So yeah, we'll link to all of those. But yeah, like you said, there's a lot going on today. So I did want to, do you have a few more minutes or no? Do you have to go? Okay. There's so much going on right now. And like, this is super important. No, well, one question that I want to ask is like, So all these things like the genocide thing is being has been brought into like international court. There is an international court now, like the past couple of decades. Like, is this something like new for humanity that we're like becoming more aware of these things? Because genocides and like mass killings and all this stuff has been happening for so long. So do you feel like this is a like it's showing that we're getting better? Like, are we becoming more cognizant of things? And right now you said like there's so much going on in the world. Has it always been like this, or is it particularly bad right now?
Yeah.
Or are we seeing it on our phones more, or what's going on?
I think there's a few things that are happening. One is that in terms of the history of the world, like going all the way back, we're inherently in a better place than we ever were, right? In terms of we're healthier, less people are dying of disease, there's less poverty, and there's less violence.
Okay, objectively.
If you look at the long term.
Great. We'll
If
just
you,
stop the podcast there. Thank you, Gissou John. Okay, no, go on.
so in terms of the long-term trends, we're obviously doing a lot better than we were centuries ago, let's say,
Okay.
before like the creation of penicillin and things like that. Like we're doing better. What is falling apart now is the post-World War II system. So the post-World War II system was largely created by the US, being, the force that ultimately settled the trajectory of where things were going to go in the world with, the defeat of Nazi Germany and fascism and all that. A lot of important financial institutions were set up after then. The United Nations was set up after then. The International Court of Justice, which is an organ of the United Nations, was set up after then. So like there was a lot of important multilateralism as a whole was more or less set up after that. Now, there are a lot of people around the world who critique these systems and say they've only helped powerful nations and they've further, disadvantaged less powerful nations and smaller countries. That's one interpretation. Another interpretation is that it's really led towards a stronger global peace and stability. And I think it's pretty undeniable that we're in a more peaceful place post World War II than we were before because we were having world wars. Obviously, technology has scaled since then. Weaponry has scaled since then. The advent of nuclear weaponry, is a scary addition. So a lot of things have changed in terms of capacity for violence, capacity for destruction. And that makes it even more important that there are global systems where like mutually assured destruction and deterrence like prevent us from doing things. One important way to achieve global peace and stability has been to have an international trade regime and to have free markets and to have, to not have isolationist politics. So I think what's a little concerning right now, whether it's with the tariff war or increased protectionism, is like we're moving away from the idea that the US essentially set up. We're moving away from that idea to a model that's more isolationist, that's more insular, that's more xenophobic, that's why defense budgets are going up around the world. Every country is looking to shore up their defense budget. So we're working less on international cooperation to solve the big issues that we have of the day. And we're actually turning the clock back to a time where we were less prosperous, less safe, less peaceful. And there's rising authoritarianism. So these for me are very concerning hallmarks of the current period that we're in. And it's really because the administration that's in the US is a revolutionary administration. They have revolutionary fervor of trying to knock down an entire system. Revolutions are all about like chaos, control, and eliminating things completely. And that's what's happening here. It's just that we elected, or I mean, obviously when I say we, I mean not all of us, but the US elected somebody that's ushering in a revolution. And that's not unique to the US. That also happened in Venezuela, which was once a prosperous, oil-rich democracy and is now a failing dictatorship. That's happening in Hungary. Viktor Orban, who is, somebody that President Trump loves and really thinks is great. is driving Hungary into the ground in many ways. They, attacks on the free press, attacks on the judiciary. And at first, he was saying it was for prosperity's sake, but Hungary is doing very poorly economically now. So I don't think any of these things are good for long-term stability. And then when it's the US, it doesn't just stay in the US. So what happened with Venezuela and Hungary, I mean, there might be some knock-on effects for Latin America, a little bit in Europe and in the EU, which Hungary is part of, but the US really is the bedrock and like the core of the system. And so I think we're going to start to see there were already conversations happening, but serious conversations about, not being pegged to the US dollar anymore. One reason that we have economic supremacy, like the US is so powerful economically, is because of how many currencies are pegged to the US dollar. Like there's definitely discussions around that not happening anymore. And US soft power is definitely just destroyed because of the destruction of USAID and these other things. So we're moving towards a less prosperous, less peaceful world on the current trajectory. But some things could change that. There could be a serious recession here in the US due to these fiscal policies. And then maybe people will vote differently because I think so much of the vote was centered around economic, lower prices and things like that. So, I mean, we'll see. But tariffs are essentially, I mean, they've been paused now, but tariffs are essentially, well, some of them, but tariffs are essentially a tax on consumers. And I don't know that the economics of that is always well understood.
Right. So then what should we kind of be paying attention to? What should we be doing with everything going on right now? What would you say? Oh, and one thing that you'd said that you wanted to talk about was also the naturalized citizen. So, for example, I was born
Yeah.
in Iran. I became a citizen when I was 10. And I've been very outspoken. As a person who has my own business and is a citizen, I felt completely fine, like talking about Gaza and talking about, being outspoken about the Islamic Republic. So what should someone like me be thinking about at this point?
I think the most important thing is to not be afraid.
Yeah.
Actually. So the way that dictatorships win, and here we're in a situation where we have somebody who is clearly an admirer of authoritarianism. I'm not going to go so far as to say we're living in a dictatorship. That's way too extreme. There's many shades of that. But we have somebody in the White House who has authoritarian tendencies, always has had authoritarian tendencies, but is more willing to act on them now. And the thing that people need to understand is like, historically, that never stays with like any one group or any one population. Like you might think, oh, I'm fine. Like, no, you're not. In Russia, oligarchs, basically people who became very wealthy when public assets were privatized and up for grabs with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, those oligarchs got together and decided that they wanted Vladimir Putin to be their guy. They basically made sure that he won. And then with time, Vladimir Putin went after a lot of those same oligarchs when he fell out with them. And those same people who put him in office were then in jail or mysteriously poisoned or falling out of windows, defenestration, which is like one mode of operation there. So those things happen, right? So nobody's insulated. It doesn't matter how rich you are. It doesn't matter your immigration status. Like nobody's insulated in a state where there's absolute power, where there's no checks and balances, and where there's no due process. And so the things I want people to pay attention to right now are like what's happening with Supreme Court rulings that are being disregarded. Like just today, we're hearing that, the Supreme Court had made a ruling that it wrongly deported man from El Salvador, like somebody who was legally here in the US, a Maryland father, was sent to El Sacot, which is like the top maximum security prison in El Salvador. And ICE admitted they made a mistake, but now nobody's bringing him back. And it's like, well, you guys can find him. Like, this is a maximum security prison that's super organized with all the weapons. Like, you guys can find him, but the president of El Salvador, Nayib Bukele, he was at the White House yesterday saying, we're not going to bring this terrorist back in. He's calling this guy a terrorist who there's absolutely no evidence that he's part of any gang. And ICE admitted they made a mistake. They're unwilling.
And a 9-0 ruling too. It's not even a question.
Supreme Court said you need to bring the guy back or you need to facilitate his return. And we see that it's unclear if the Trump administration is going to comply. So when we start to get in the place where they're defying court orders, that would render the courts impotent, and then we don't have an important check and balance. Like we obviously have the executive, the legislature, the judiciary. Legislature being Republican controlled and unfortunately seems to be like rubber stamping a lot of what the executive does. The judiciary was like one last check. If they're being ignored, then what's the check? So that matters for all of us, like disregarding due process, ignoring court orders. That matters for all of us because it will be applied in a lot of other spaces. So what people should be doing is supporting the free press. The free press is one of like independent media that's really investigating all of this and like bringing it out to the surface and framing it in a way that we need.
What do you mean by supporting?
I think that financially, a
Okay,
lot of these journalists are suffering. I mean, like
got it.
journalism has taken some real hits. And we see that the journalism that has been bought by billionaires, like
Right.
Washington Post, I mean, so far their news side seems to be unaffected. But as we see their editorial side, Jeff Bezos made it very clear we can only write about like rights and free markets or something. I mean, it's all kinds of free speech restrictions. I mean, anyway, I won't get into the free speech analysis because he's not a government actor. But the point is like, it's against the spirit of free speech in the First Amendment. We see a lot of First Amendment violations happening by the state. The way that determinations are being made with the revocation of student visas, the fact that a lot of these individuals are just being targeted over what appears to be their exercise of free speech in this country, which is their right, because free speech is not just restricted to citizens. It's anybody who's in the U.S. benefits from the free speech rights in the Constitution. Um, that's something that it's all interconnected. There's no one group that's going to be spared that when the norms are eroded, when all of that is eroded. So we need to support the free press and keeping the pressure on. We need to make sure that people are not capitulating. One of the most concerning things is seeing big law firms just bend the knee and say, you know what, like we're going to do that. Some of them didn't even challenge the executive orders that were being brought against them that basically are restricting their free speech by saying they can only focus on certain areas of pro bono practice. Um, and like that just can't happen. Academia capitulating, the example of Columbia. Now we see some other counterexamples like Harvard just took a stand saying like, no, we're not going to do that. That's the right approach. Like there's no reason to capitulate in advance. And also when people start to be scared, you can't, dictators cannot thrive when there's mass protests. We see that even in a place like Iran, where the dictatorship is super entrenched, right? When they can't control the population, when all the women are like just taking off mandatory hijab, what are they going to do? Like they can't control that at some point. And so that's why the top thing, like if we learn anything from our Iranian, brothers and sisters, is like definitely don't be capitulating in advance. And these things always have a beginning phase. To people who are like, oh, isn't this an exaggeration? It's like, well, President Trump has said that he plans on staying for a third term. You can't be more open than that about what's intended, So no, I mean, this is the beginning phase of rising authoritarianism. So everybody needs to be very like careful about that. And it's not an exaggeration, and it will impact every single person because you will be less secure, you will be less prosperous, our health will be
Right.
affected when there aren't government regulations to make sure the products we're eating, the medicines we're taking are actually up to a standard. You got all those
Right.
federal functions. How are we supposed to know what's in the formula we're giving a baby?
Right. Right. But yeah, I think that you're right. Like it's important. Like you say that you're not coming from it as a partisan. You're not like making political statements, but you are focused on human rights. And I feel like all of those of us who like have a voice, have an ability to like talk about human rights, especially since like our counterparts in Iran don't have that right. Like it is possible that they're going to get jailed or we're kind of there, but we should not be afraid to really speak up and make our voices heard. I think that's super important.
Yeah, a lot of Iranian Americans and Iranians in the diaspora were concerned about speaking loudly about Iran
Yes.
because would they be able to travel back? Would they be what?
Yes.
Those same considerations are now coming into play for the US. I
Exactly.
had a longtime follower, somebody who follows me on Instagram. I don't know them personally, but somebody who had often sends me like nice messages, are very kind. They were traveling to the US and they actually said, I'm gonna unfollow you temporarily just because I know they're going through social media feeds and seeing like who do you follow, who do you not, and you've been very vocal. So I'm gonna unfollow you, but I'll follow
Yeah.
you when I return. Again, I said that's whatever you're comfortable with, it's just
Yeah.
like a person who filled out. And that's those are the kinds of calculations we make when we travel and visit Iran. I can't visit Iran
Right.
anymore, but those are the calculations people make when they visit Iran. That's the kind of calculations people are making coming here.
Absolutely. Yeah, I've heard a lot of people say that taking burner phones or not taking their laptops with them. Absolutely, they're making those calculations. That is too bad.
So that's an indication of where we are. And so
Right.
where Iranian Americans have been speaking about human rights in Iran, now we also have to look at like civil liberties in the US. A lot of the same framework applies. It's just unfortunately now playing out here in a certain way,
Yeah.
and that can accelerate with time.
And one other thing that I want to kind of end on, in terms of social media, like you have a social media presence and you talk about these issues a lot and you have really helpful videos. And I want to link to you for more people to find you and listen to what you have to say. I think that there's other accounts. It's really hard to have an account like yours where you're making common sense, you know, you're speaking about common sense things, you're speaking about human rights. It's not inflammatory. Like those inflammatory accounts, unfortunately, rack up millions of views and millions of followers. And I want to urge everyone to find people like you, because you do really stick to, things that we need to know and have a really wonderful way of explaining things. So I don't know if you have any comments about that, about kind of our diaspora getting sucked into these inflammatory things rather than sticking to what we need to.
I mean, I'm just the opposite of clickbait, and it's just like something I've just got to accept. I'm like, sometimes they say that I'm just so boring, right? Like just to follow me. But somebody just yesterday said, you know what? You're not boring. You're just not theatrical, you know?
Exactly.
And that's
Yeah.
good. And like we need all kinds of people. So, theatrical people also serve a purpose, right? Like everybody serves a purpose, but it's like kind of know what you're going to that account for. So if you're going to an account for information, it's usually best to go to like a more sober account that's really doing research and maybe like shows the receipts as well, or where they're not necessarily falling into like one very ideological or polarized lens, right? Because that's usually not coming from a place of research or a place of objectivity. Like it would be very wrong for me to say every single thing that President Trump does is terrible. That's just not true, right? That's not true. There are things I can point to where I say, that in theory is a good move, like his conversation around the Panama Canal. Of course, then he's helping China in like a zillion other ways through through dismantling the aid system and the tariffs. But like his spirit on the Panama Canal is right. His impulse to try to negotiate peace agreements instead of maybe being more militaristic or more hawkish as people in the Republican Party and also the Democratic Party have historically been, centrists, I guess, in DC are often like a little more quick to the military option. He seems to not want that. He tries to take a more maybe business centric approach, but that's not horrible. Like that's not
Right.
horrible at all. We can disagree on like maybe like the nuts and bolts. Like in Ukraine, it's maybe just a surrender, which is like one way to end a war. But like the spirit is like not wrong, right? So I think when you follow accounts that are like prepared to say that sort of thing or like really to just
Right.
look at things objectively, then you know what you're visiting that account for. But definitely check the sourcing of what people are saying because there's a lot of spin. And it can be tempting to kind of have it spoon fed to us. And it's also attractive, right? When people propose an easy solution, when they're like, this is what you need to do. This is like, just vote for Trump, everything will be fine. Or like, just vote for whatever and everything will be fine. And it's like, it's just not like that. And
Right.
so it's not
Right.
as easy or digestible for maybe like a 1 minute video, but the reality is not so digestible. So I try to make things like very complex topics in a way that's more digestible, but
Yes,
without
absolutely.
the nuance, which is like, at the end of the day, I'm not going to pretend, and I'm not going to like scream and shout to get like views. I'm just going to present the information and hope that the people who want to see that see that. But all these personalities serve different functions. I would just say that what I would love to see from I think Iranians have that down pretty pat, but like the Iranian diaspora, who's very vocal and very loud on lots of issues, I would like to see more teamwork, more consensus, less ego. Ego usually is the enemy of all of these things. And I think anytime I see somebody being like too like, it's about me, or like my plight, or me, for me, that's like almost an immediate turn off, because I know then they're not really thinking about the we. They're just like very focused on the me. So we need more of the people who focus on the we, but the people who focus on the we are often more quiet. I was a
Exactly.
reluctant Instagram user. I just uploaded a video about how to remove the Islamic Republic from the UN Commission on the Status of Women. And then people were just like really asking me to put the content up. And I started to think like, we actually need to do this because it helps people like orient around what they could do. But I'm not somebody who is like ever using TikTok, or like, I don't really like to be in front of the camera. Like that wasn't ever, I was always like drafting quietly in the corner. It was really
Right.
just because I saw there was a need for it. And people write me a lot of messages telling me to, do this video, do that video, do this video. So they're like asking for stuff. If I thought, sometimes I'm like, is this even like, does this serve a purpose? Like, who cares? But because I get messages like that, I realize people are very hungry for it. And so I continue making the videos. Um, and lately, people are telling me like they want a lot of videos about what's going on in this country, in the US, but they won't publicly comment as much. So I get a lot of direct messages on this, like a lot about what's going on and trying to make sense of the moment, but they won't publicly comment as much. And I think that relates to the fear question that we've been talking about. It's like a concern to be seen as like endorsing it or like liking it.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for all the work you do. I know it's not always the most glamorous work or the most out there work, or you don't get thanked enough for it. You're really doing good work quietly for many, many, many years. So I really appreciate it. I think that it's very important and really wonderful. And thank you. I don't know what else to say besides thank you so much for doing that.
Thanks for having me on this podcast. I'm so glad that we got to chat. And yeah, there's so many things that I work on that I can't talk about publicly, but I've been trying to straddle the balance between letting people know about, like, giving a peek under the hood about some of the things so people are informed, versus like there's some things I just honestly I'm not at liberty to, discuss publicly.
And it's a long game. I mean, you've been doing this for decades now, and it's a, like we said, these things are just coming online into like humanity. So you're on the cusp of a lot of really important stuff, and hopefully it'll have repercussions for centuries to come. So thanks again. And please, so we'll link to your Instagram on here and the gender apartheid initiatives that you're doing. And anytime there's new updated information, please let us know. We'll spread the word for sure.
For sure. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.